The air inside the auction barn hung heavy with the mingled scents of leather, sawdust, and animal sweat, a world away from the sterile conference rooms Jackson Reed typically occupied. His tailored charcoal suit and polished Oxfords marked him as an outsider among the denim-clad farmers and serious horse traders. He hadn't planned on attending today's event. It was merely an impromptu diversion, something to fill the hours between closing an 8-figure acquisition and returning to the suffocating pressure of his tech empire. Jackson leaned against the metal railing, absently checking his platinum watch while the auctioneer's rhythmic chant rolled across the gathered crowd. A magnificent chestnut stallion pranced in the center ring, muscles rippling beneath a gleaming coat as bids climbed steadily higher. The animal was worth every penny, but Jackson felt nothing. No interest, no connection. Then he saw her. In the farthest corner of the holding area, almost hidden in shadow, stood a gray mare. Unlike the other horses that shifted restlessly in their temporary confines, she remained utterly motionless. Her head hung low, her dull coat matted with neglect. But what stopped Jackson's breath was her eye. A single tear traced down her sunken cheek, cutting a path through the dust on her face. Jackson found himself moving toward her stall, without conscious decision, drawn by something he couldn't name. Up close, the mare was even more pitiful, ribs visible beneath her hide, scars crisscrossing her flanks, her spirit visibly broken. She didn't acknowledge his presence, didn't flick an ear or shift away. It was as if she'd given up entirely. The older handler with a weathered face near her stall explained that she was damaged goods, unresponsive to anything anymore. They were only running her through auction as a formality before shipping her off. Jackson knew exactly what that meant. The slaughterhouse. Something cold and hard settled in his chest. When Jackson asked about her past, he learned she came from a breeding operation gone bust. They had worked her too hard, taken too many foals. Her last one had died, and she had simply quit. The handler believed some animals break beyond repair. Jackson stared at the mare, who hadn't moved a muscle during the entire conversation. In her emptiness, in her surrender, he saw something achingly familiar, a reflection of what he'd become in his relentless pursuit of success. A shell, a machine, a creature that had forgotten how to feel. A memory surfaced. Ina's self as a child, watching helplessly as a neighbor's neglected horse was loaded into a trailer, never to return. He'd promised himself then he would never stand by again if he could help. The mare would be up for auction soon, and Jackson Reed, who had built an empire on calculating risks and returns, made the least rational decision of his life. The auctioneer's voice crackled through the dusty arena as the gray mare was led into the ring. She moved mechanically, her hooves dragging across the dirt floor, head still bowed, as if expecting a blow. Around Jackson, the crowd shifted and murmured, their disinterest palpable. These people knew broken merchandise when they saw it. The mare stood motionless under the harsh lights, not even bothering to flick away the flies that landed on her dull coat. Opening bid at $200, folks. The auctioneer's enthusiasm felt forced, his gaze already scanning the crowd for the next lot. The silence stretched uncomfortably. No hands raised, no nods given. 150? Anyone? The price dropped lower, bottom-feeding territory, and still no takers. The mare hadn't even lifted her head, as if she knew her value had been calculated and found wanting. $2,000. Jackson's voice cut through the silence, firm and clear. The crowd turned as one, necks craning to see who had spoken. The auctioneer stuttered, momentarily thrown off his rhythm before recovering with practiced professionalism. Do I hear 2,100? When no other bids materialized, the gavel came down with finality. Sold to the gentleman in the suit. Later, as Jackson completed the paperwork, the auction manager eyed him warily while thumbing through his crisp bills. He revealed the mare's name was Whisper, though he couldn't imagine why Jackson would care. No racing bloodlines, no breeding value, nothing but trouble since she arrived. The previous owners had labeled her dangerous, unpredictable, prone to episodes of complete shutdown, a waste of good feed, in the manager's estimation. Jackson ignored the sidelong glances and whispered comments that followed him as he arranged for transport. He'd spent his career being underestimated by men in rooms just like this. Men who thought they knew value when they saw it, who couldn't recognize potential beneath damaged surfaces. He'd prove them wrong again. The Mare, Whisper, was loaded into his trailer with minimal fuss, too defeated even for resistance. Jackson watched her blank stare, the mechanical way she followed basic commands without engagement. The auction staff couldn't contain their bemused expressions as they pocketed his money, rich city types and their pet projects. They gave it a month before he'd be looking to unload her again. As Jackson climbed into his Range Rover to follow the transport back to Willow Creek Estate, his phone buzzed incessantly with notifications. Board members demanding decisions, investors seeking reassurances, deadlines looming, the weight of empire building pressed against his shoulders. For once, he silenced them all without a second thought. Jackson glanced at the trailer ahead through the windshield, something resolute settling in his chest. The Mare's tear, that single, impossible tear, had awakened something he'd thought long buried. Whether saving her was an act of compassion or self-preservation, he couldn't yet say. All he knew was that inside that trailer rode more than just a broken horse. Inside rode a second chance. The golden sunset painted the pristine white fences of Willow Creek Estate as Jackson's trailer pulled into the curved driveway. Marcus Thornton, silver-haired and weathered from 30 years of managing elite thoroughbreds, stood waiting with arms crossed and disapproval etched into the deep lines of his face. The moment Whisper was led down the ramp, that disapproval hardened into something closer to dismay. Even in the gentle evening light, the Mare looked worse than merely neglected. She looked broken beyond repair. Under the stark lights of the immaculate stable, Whisper's condition became even more apparent. Her dull coat hung loosely over protruding ribs, a stark contrast to the gleaming muscled bodies of the champion horses that watched curiously from neighboring stalls. The scars across her flanks told stories no one wanted to hear. Marcus ran experienced hands over her, his touch gentle despite his obvious reservations. His assessment was blunt, but not unkind. The Mare was malnourished, possibly diseased, and showing signs of severe psychological trauma. He questioned whether Jackson understood what he'd taken on, suggesting that sometimes kindness meant ending suffering rather than prolonging it. Jackson simply instructed that Whisper be given the largest stall, fresh bedding, and the same premium feed as his competition horses. Marcus shook his head, but complied, muttering under his breath about wealthy men and their impulsive decisions. Over the following days, Whisper remained unchanged. She stood in the corner of her spacious stall, head hanging low, refusing the fresh water and premium grain that sat untouched in her feeders. The other horses nickered and moved about their daily routines, exercising in the paddocks, receiving grooming, engaging with their handlers. Whisper remained a statue, existing rather than living. Jackson found himself drawn to the stables at odd hours, slipping away from conference calls and product launches to stand outside her stall. The tech mogul, who commanded boardrooms and directed hundreds of employees, stood helpless before this silent creature who refused to acknowledge him. He read about trauma in horses, about rehabilitation techniques, about patience and boundaries. Nothing in his business success had prepared him for this kind of challenge, one that couldn't be solved with money or brilliant strategy. On the fifth night, after a particularly frustrating day of meetings, Jackson grabbed a blanket from his house and returned to the stables. The night air carried the sweet scent of hay and the occasional soft shuffling of horses settling for the night. He sank down outside Whisper's stall, back against the polished wood, and simply sat. No expectations, no demands, just presence. Hours passed. Somewhere around midnight, Jackson thought he heard it. The softest exhale, different from before. He didn't move, didn't turn. But when morning found him still there, neck stiff from sleeping upright, Whisper stood, not in her corner, but at the front of her stall, watching him with eyes that still held emptiness, but perhaps, just perhaps, the faintest question. The days at Willow Creek merged into weeks, marked by incremental changes so small they might have been imagined. Whisper had begun to eat, though sparingly, and occasionally acknowledged the stable hands with a flick of her ear. She still refused to leave her stall, still flinched at unexpected movements, still stood for hours staring at nothing. Jackson continued his nightly vigils, despite Marcus's warnings that he was setting himself up for disappointment. Some horses never came back from wherever trauma had sent them. 23 days after Whisper's arrival, the spring storm rolled in without warning. The afternoon sky darkened to an ominous purple-black, winds whipping across the valley with unusual ferocity. Jackson was reviewing acquisition paperwork in his study when the first crash of thunder shook the windows. The rain came next, driving sheets that obscured the view of the stables. Something pulled at Jackson's attention, a sense of urgency he couldn't explain. He grabbed a raincoat and jogged across the property, the manicured lawn already turning to mud beneath his feet. Inside the stable, horses shuffled nervously as lightning flashed. Marcus and the staff moved efficiently, checking each animal, speaking in low, reassuring tones. Whisper's stall stood empty. The paddock gate swung wildly in the wind, and Jackson knew without being told. He pushed through the downpour toward the far field, rain instantly soaking through his expensive coat, plastering his hair to his forehead. Near the center of the pasture stood a gray figure, motionless despite the tempest raging around her. Whisper stood with her head lowered, her thin body exposed to the full fury of the storm. She wasn't running, wasn't seeking shelter. She simply stood there, receiving the punishment of the elements, as if it were her due, as if she deserved nothing better than pain and cold. Jackson approached slowly, rain blinding him, mud sucking at his leather shoes. When he reached her, he didn't try to catch her or lead her to safety. Instead, he did the one thing that made no rational sense. He sat down in the mud beside her, the rain pounding against his shoulders, and simply waited. Minutes stretched into an hour. The storm raged. Jackson remained, his clothes saturated, his body chilled to the bone. He didn't speak, didn't reach for her, just remained present in her suffering, sharing it. Then it happened, so subtle he might have missed it had he not been completely still. Whisper shifted her weight, angling her body slightly toward his. It wasn't much, barely an acknowledgement, but in that slight lean, that infinitesimal choice to move toward rather than away, lay the first fragile thread of trust. Lightning cracked across the sky, illuminating them both in stark white, the broken mare and the drenched man, connected by something wordless and profound. Another crack of thunder, and Whisper lowered her head until it nearly touched Jackson's shoulder, her breath warm against the cold rain. Marcus found them like that. An hour later, both soaked to the skin, neither willing to be the first to break the tenuous connection. For the first time since her arrival, Whisper walked willingly when Jackson finally stood, following him back to the stable without a lead rope, each step small but deliberate, each step a choice. The morning sun cast long shadows across Willow Creek's training ring, where Jackson watched Whisper with growing frustration. 3 weeks had passed since the storm, and while the mare would now follow him from stall to paddock, she remained a ghost of a horse. She ate mechanically, moved when directed, but the vacancy in her eyes remained unchanged. Every attempt to brush her resulted in violent trembling. Any unexpected noise sent her retreating deep into herself. Jackson scrolled through his phone, searching for answers beyond what Marcus could provide. The name Dr. Sophia Chen appeared repeatedly in articles about traumatized horses, a veterinarian who specialized in cases others had abandoned. Her waiting list was legendary, her fees astronomical, but money had never been Jackson's obstacle. His assistant secured an appointment in exchange for a sizable donation to Dr. Chen's equine sanctuary. When she arrived 3 days later, Dr. Chen was nothing like Jackson expected. No white coat, no entourage of assistants, just a compact woman in worn jeans and a faded flannel shirt, her dark hair pulled into a practical braid. She carried a single weathered leather bag and wore an expression of practiced neutrality that bordered on skepticism. This wasn't her first call from a wealthy client with a rescue fantasy. Her assessment of Whisper was methodical, silent, and thorough. She examined the mare's body, noting the pattern of scars, the way she held her weight, the subtle tension in specific muscles. She observed Whisper's reactions to different stimuli, sounds, movements, objects. She watched how the mare responded when Jackson approached versus when Marcus or the other handlers came near. The evaluation took hours, during which Dr. Chen barely acknowledged Jackson's attempts at conversation. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the quiet authority of someone who didn't need to prove her expertise. Whisper's trauma went deeper than physical abuse. The breeding operation had systematically broken her will through calculated cruelty, likely taking multiple foals from her before they were weaned, possibly forcing her to witness their mistreatment. Jackson listened, his stomach tightening at each clinical observation. He wanted solutions, timelines, guarantees. Dr. Chen offered none. Recovery, if it came at all, would not follow a corporate schedule. It could not be rushed or forced. What Whisper needed most was consistency, boundaries, and someone willing to meet her exactly where she was, not where they wished her to be. When Jackson pressed for more concrete plans, Dr. Chen's expression hardened. Horses weren't malfunctioning products to be repaired. They were sentient beings whose trust, once shattered, could only be rebuilt through patience and profound respect for their agency. If Jackson wanted miracle cures, he should look elsewhere. The challenge in her words struck something in Jackson. He had built his empire by recognizing value in what others dismissed, by seeing potential where others saw only risk. He recognized in Dr. Chen a kindred stubbornness, a refusal to accept conventional limitations. When she finally agreed to stay and work with Whisper, it came with conditions. Her methods would not be rushed. Jackson would participate fully in the process, no matter how demanding his corporate schedule. And most importantly, he would need to accept that success might look nothing like what he imagined. For perhaps the first time in his adult life, Jackson Reed agreed to terms he hadn't negotiated. The morning air carried the scent of fresh hay and damp earth as Jackson watched Dr. Chen work with Whisper in the round pen. 4 weeks into their rehabilitation program, subtle changes had emerged in the mare's demeanor. Her head no longer hung quite so low. Her eyes tracked movement with growing awareness rather than dull resignation. When Jackson approached with an apple, she would sometimes take a tentative step forward instead of retreating to her corner. Dr. Chen had established a routine of gentle, consistent interaction. No sudden movements, no expectations, just quiet presence and respectful distance that gradually decreased as Whisper's comfort grew. Jackson had learned to read the mare's body language, the slight tilt of her ears, the barely perceptible shift of weight that signaled anxiety or cautious interest. This morning, Dr. Chen conducted a more thorough physical examination, something Whisper had previously resisted. Her hands moved methodically over the mare's body, checking muscle tone, assessing the improvement in her coat's condition. When her hands paused at Whisper's abdomen, her expression changed. She spent several minutes there, her face growing increasingly serious before stepping back with a sharp intake of breath. The news landed like a stone in still water. Whisper wasn't just traumatized and malnourished. She was pregnant. Despite her terrible condition, she carried new life inside her, a foal conceived before her arrival at Willow Creek. Dr. Chen estimated she was approximately 5 months along, the pregnancy hidden by her emaciated state and overlooked in the initial examinations. Jackson's mind raced with implications. A pregnancy would strain Whisper's already compromised body. Her psychological trauma complicated everything further. Would she even accept the foal after birth given her history? Dr. Chen's voice remained clinical but urgent as she outlined necessary changes to Whisper's nutrition and care. The stakes had suddenly doubled. That night, Jackson sat in his study, the glow of his laptop illuminating his tired face as he dug deeper into Whisper's past. Money and connections opened doors that would have remained closed to others. What he uncovered turned his stomach. Whisper had been part of an industrial breeding operation with a reputation for cutting corners and maximizing profits. Mares were kept pregnant nearly continuously, their foals taken too early and sold to questionable buyers. Records showed Whisper had delivered 4 foals in 5 years, an exhausting schedule even for a healthy horse. Her last pregnancy had ended in a stillbirth, after which she had simply stopped performing and was deemed worthless. There were health violations, complaints from former employees, investigations that somehow never resulted in serious consequences. The operation had finally closed, its assets, including its horses, liquidated to cover debts. Whisper had ended up at the auction as part of that liquidation, just another piece of discarded equipment. Jackson closed his laptop, his jaw tight with cold fury. Outside his window, the stable stood quiet under the moonlight. Inside one of those stalls, Whisper carried a foal who represented something beyond economic value, a continuation, a second chance, perhaps even redemption. The thought settled in his chest with unexpected weight. For the first time in his life, success would not be measured in dollars or achievements, but in the simple, profound act of bringing new life safely into the world. And somehow, that seemed more significant than anything else he had ever accomplished. The night was unusually still, the air heavy with humidity that promised summer rain. Jackson sat in his office reviewing quarterly projections when his phone vibrated with Marcus's name. The stable manager never called this late unless something was wrong. Jackson was already moving before he even answered, some primal instinct tightening his chest as he raced toward the stables. The scene inside hit him like a physical blow. Whisper lay on her side in the straw, her body heaving with pain, legs occasionally thrashing against the stall walls. Sweat darkened her coat to a stormy gray, her eyes wild with fear and agony. Dr. Chen was already there, her movements quick and precise as she checked vital signs, her face a mask of controlled urgency. Colic. The word fell between them like a sentence. In horses, what might be simple stomach pain in humans could quickly become fatal. For a pregnant mare already weakened by malnutrition and stress, the prognosis darkened by the minute. If they couldn't get the condition under control, they would lose both Whisper and her unborn foal. The next hours passed in a fog of desperate activity. Dr. Chen administered medications while Jackson walked Whisper whenever she could stand, keeping her moving to prevent intestinal twisting. When the mare collapsed again, they supported her, spoke to her, urged her to fight. The stable hands brought heated blankets, fresh water, whatever was needed without being asked. As midnight stretched toward dawn, Whisper's breathing grew increasingly labored. Each time she went down, it took longer to get her back up. Dr. Chen's face betrayed what her words didn't. They were losing this battle. In the small hours, as rain finally began to patter against the stable roof, Jackson found himself alone with Whisper during one of Dr. Chen's brief absences. The mare's eyes, clouded with pain, fixed on him with an expression that cracked something open inside his chest. She was giving up. The memory surfaced without warning. Jackson at 8 years old, standing helpless outside the neighbor's barn, where an old gelding named Copper lay dying from neglect. He had brought the horse apples for weeks, had begged his parents to do something, but the adults had all looked away, not their business. His father had insisted. Some things couldn't be fixed. He had found Copper's stall empty the next day, had carried that helplessness for decades. Now, kneeling in the straw beside Whisper, that same choking sense of powerlessness threatened to overwhelm him. But this time was different. This time he wasn't a child. This time he had resources, knowledge, and the stubborn refusal to accept what others might call inevitable. Jackson pressed his forehead against Whisper's neck. His voice barely a whisper. He spoke of spring pastures, of running free, of the foal she carried, promises he had no right to make, but offered anyway. Beneath his palm, her heartbeat fluttered, uneven but persistent. When Dr. Chen returned, Whisper's eyes were still open, still fighting. The mare who had given up on everything was somehow holding on, one painful breath at a time. Something passed between Jackson and Dr. Chen then, not quite hope, but a fierce determination that tonight at least, death would not win. The stable was eerily quiet as dawn broke over Willow Creek. The usual morning routines, suspended in the heavy anticipation that filled the air. Whisper had survived the colic episode, but 3 weeks later, something else was happening. Her sides heaved with unmistakable contractions. Her legs splayed awkwardly as she fought to remain standing. The foal was coming nearly a month early. Dr. Chen's face remained carefully neutral as she prepared the stall, but Jackson caught the concern in her swift, economical movements. Whisper was still underweight, her body depleted from the colic and the months of neglect. Before that, this birth would demand every ounce of strength she had, strength Jackson wasn't certain she possessed. The labor progressed with agonizing slowness. Whisper paced, then stood trembling, then lay down only to struggle up again, instinct driving her despite exhaustion. By midday, Dr. Chen's carefully maintained composure had given way to visible worry. She checked Whisper again, her hands feeling for the foal's position. The tightening of her jaw told Jackson everything before she spoke. The foal was positioned wrong, a dangerous complication, even for a healthy mare. The next hours blurred together in a haze of tension and desperate focus. Dr. Chen worked tirelessly, her arms slick to the shoulders as she attempted to turn the foal inside the birth canal. Whisper's eyes rolled white with pain, her body shuddering with effort. Twice she collapsed, her legs buckling beneath her. Twice they helped her up, knowing that if she surrendered to exhaustion now, they would lose everything. Jackson stayed at her head, his hand steady on her neck, his voice a constant stream of encouragement. The mare who had once flinched from human touch now leaned into him as if drawing strength from his presence. Her trust, hard won over months of patience, became the thread they both clung to as her body fought its most difficult battle. Just as the afternoon light began to fade, Dr. Chen's expression changed. The foal had turned. Now came the final push. Whisper gathered her remaining strength, her entire body tensing with one massive effort. Time seemed suspended as the foal finally emerged, slipping onto the straw in a rush of fluid and blood. But the triumph froze in Jackson's throat. The foal lay motionless, unnaturally still, its coat slick and dark. Dr. Chen moved with frantic precision, clearing airways, rubbing the tiny body, performing chest compressions on the impossibly fragile rib cage. Nothing, no movement, no breath. Jackson felt something break inside him. After everything, after the rescue, the rehabilitation, the colic, the grueling labor, to lose the foal now seemed like a cruelty beyond bearing. Beside him, Whisper struggled to turn, to see her baby, her eyes wide with an emotion Jackson had never witnessed in her before. Desperation. Then, as if responding to its mother's need, rather than the medical intervention, the foal's chest hitched. A tiny shudder ran through its body. Another breath. Stronger this time. A weak kick. Dr. Chen continued her ministrations with renewed urgency, and suddenly the small creature was breathing steadily, its head lifting in wobbly effort. The foal was alive, a delicate filly with her mother's gray coat marked by a perfect white star between her eyes. Jackson found himself kneeling in the straw, overcome by something he couldn't name. Later, he would register the dampness on his cheeks. Later, he would hear himself whisper the name that came unbidden to his lips. Miracle. The late summer sun cast golden light across Willow Creek's rolling pastures, transforming ordinary grass into fields of shimmering amber. Jackson leaned against the white fence, watching the scene before him with quiet wonder. Whisper stood tall in the center of the meadow, her once dull coat now gleaming silver in the afternoon light. Her head was held high, ears pricked forward with alertness that bordered on pride as she watched her foal prance around her in playful circles. 4 months had passed since Miracle's birth. The spindly, barely breathing creature had transformed into a spirited filly whose gangly legs carried her in ever-widening explorations of the world. Her mother's watchful presence never strayed far, but the fear that had once defined Whisper had been replaced by something resembling confidence, perhaps even joy. The transformation went beyond physical appearance. 2 weeks ago, Marcus had come running to the main house, his typically stoic expression replaced by astonishment. Whisper had vocalized, a clear, strong whinny that rang across the stables when Miracle had wandered too far. The mare, who had arrived in silence, too broken even to express pain, had found her voice again. Behind Jackson, the sounds of laughter and conversation drifted from the small gathering near the stables. A celebration, Dr. Chen had insisted, a moment to acknowledge what had been accomplished here. The staff, veterinary assistants, even a few neighbors had gathered to share in something that had become more than just the rehabilitation of a rescue horse. Dr. Chen approached quietly, coming to stand beside him at the fence. The months of working together had softened the professional boundaries between them, creating something neither had anticipated when she first arrived with her skepticism and expertise. She handed him a glass, her fingers briefly touching his with a familiarity that still surprised him. The woman who had once challenged his every assumption now stood as a partner in something that transcended their professional roles. They watched in companionable silence as Miracle suddenly bolted across the field in a burst of exuberance, her mother immediately giving chase. Whisper's strides lengthened into a full gallop, mane and tail streaming behind her, moving with the fluid grace her body had been designed for but had forgotten until now. Jackson felt something settle in his chest, a weight he hadn't realized he'd been carrying since childhood. The memory of the horse he couldn't save had driven him for years, fueling ambitions and achievements that were meant to prove his worth, his ability to control outcomes. Yet here, in the simplicity of this moment, watching a once broken mare run freely with her foal, he found a different kind of success, not measured in acquisitions or profit margins, but in second chances and healing. As if sensing his thoughts, Whisper slowed her gallop, turning her head toward where Jackson and Dr. Chen stood. For a moment, her eyes met his, across the distance, clear, present, alive with a spirit that had once seemed extinguished forever. In saving her, Jackson had found his own redemption. If you enjoyed the story, please hit the like button and subscribe to our channel. Your support means everything to us and motivates us to bring you more stories of healing and hope. Thank you for watching, and I'll hope to see you in the next video.